Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. As our friend, neighbour and trading partner, what's going on in Australia, including in its economy, should always be of interest to us here in New Zealand. A case in point is last month's federal government budget, which saw Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's Labor government trumpeting $22.7 billion of investment over the next decade for the A Future Made in Australia initiative. In what's been described as a shift from a neoliberal to a mission-driven approach, this initiative aims to maximise the economic and industrial benefits of moving to a net zero greenhouse gas emissions economy and secure Australia's place in a changing global economic and strategic landscape. Albanese says the game has changed and the role of the government needs to evolve. Australia, he says, needs sharper elbows when it comes to marking out its national interest. To discuss this, including what it might mean for New Zealand, I'm joined by Kylie Walker. Kylie is CEO of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering and a visiting fellow at the Australian National University in Canberra. Hi, Kylie, and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Lovely to be here. Thank you, Gareth.
Look, I've given in that introduction, I guess, a bit of a taste of what A Future Made in Australia is about. But can you tell us in a bit more detail what it is and where it's come from, and I guess what the driving forces are behind it?
So the context here is really multifactorial, and you've already signalled a few of those. There are some shifting geopolitics, and we certainly in Australia have seen over the last 5 years or so a couple of economic challenges from the perspective that we don't have enough economic complexity here in Australia to withstand major challenges to our supply chains and our international trade relationships. So we rank about 70th in the world in terms of economic complexity. We have traditionally benefited. We've been incredibly lucky from the natural assets that we possess, and our economy has always been largely underpinned by minerals and by primary production. And so looking at how can we build on those natural assets to grow our economic resilience, at the same time to use science and technology and engineering to be able to uplift both the complexity and the capability of the economy across all sectors. And then also to think about how we can respectfully and pragmatically, I suppose, both tackle our commitments towards net zero and find a place, which I think we have a good potential to do as a potential green energy superpower, or one of the major players globally that is supporting this transition, which has to take place around the planet. So the current government's been in for a couple of years, and they've now had the opportunity to really kind of consolidate their policy and think about how they want to tackle this mission-based approach that you've articulated. At the same time, we've also been having some reviews of our science and technology, our research and development sectors, and where our priorities ought to lie. And really, sort of out of all of this activity has fallen out this drive for a future made in Australia. So we're looking at things like modern manufacturing. We're looking at how do we upskill ourselves around advanced computing, for example, medical technology, and we're looking at how do we move our natural assets, our mineral resources, our agricultural production up the value chain to make more of those existing sectors while we're building that clean energy sector and potentially that clean energy export future. So there's quite a lot going into it there, but I think that also brings a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, so look, one of the, I guess, buzzwords that's been around probably since the COVID pandemic, and obviously heightened by the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, is this idea of reshoring. Now, I noted in some of the material I read preparing for this that Australia is obviously, you've mentioned minerals, that you produce a lot of minerals. That a lot of the lithium, for example, is one of the big ones. But what is produced in Australia is often refined abroad, notably in China. So you talk about going up the value chain. Is that kind of what it's about as well? Is it, creating the jobs to do this in Australia and make the country more economically independent?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we don't have to do everything, obviously. We can't do everything, but we can absolutely do more than just digging it up and selling it off and then buying it back again in more technologically sophisticated forms. We know that those critical minerals are absolutely necessary for the ongoing electronics revolution, as well as for the clean energy future globally. So we can, for example, process our iron ore or it can be used in or into green iron at least, so that it can be used in green steel. And we have the minerals to make batteries for electric vehicles, for example. We have extraordinary batteries technology. Some of our researchers and developers in that space are amongst the best in the world. And so it seems to me, putting these two kind of natural assets at either end of that development spectrum together, that there ought to be a way to move us a little bit further along the value chain. There is going to be a need, of course, to think about how we approach the mining sector, the mineral sector in Australia, and how we can shift it perhaps towards where we need to be with those critical minerals. There's been a lot of thinking and research done on that for a great deal of time now. So we know what we need, where we need to focus. We know what we need to do. It's now about putting those policies, those investments, those frameworks in place to be able to affect that transition in a way that supports, jobs and skills development, and that growth in economic capability and complexity.
So yeah, you've obviously talked a bit already about the critical minerals sector, and green hydrogen is another area of focus in the Future Made in Australia initiative. What exactly do we mean when we talk about green hydrogen, and what are the hopes and expectations for this?
Green hydrogen, obviously hydrogen as an energy source. The idea of green hydrogen is that you are able to refine it, store it, and transport it in a way that is a low emissions activity, not just use it at the end to create a low emissions engine. Or energy production. So at the moment we're not there globally. I mean, the R&D isn't there. We know the R&D sector knows what needs to happen to be able to get there, but there is significant work to do, and there's a time lag involved, obviously. But this is something that markets like Japan, for instance, are really deeply interested in because it is seen as one of the mix of green fuels for the future.
Now, you've obviously touched on also how Australia is a significant miner. Lots of mining activity goes on, and obviously that still includes coal. But the likes of lithium, cobalt, and copper, which are obviously required for the push to decarbonise and move away from fossil fuels, are also mined. I'm just wondering, should we expect to see a significant volume of new mining activity on Australia through this initiative? And if that does happen, I mean, what might that mean environmentally?
So I think rather than see a huge uptick in mining activity, we're more likely to see a shift in the focus of that activity as we move away from fossil fuels and towards those rare earth minerals and critical minerals. It does absolutely have to be done in an environmentally responsible way, and that planning has to be embedded right throughout the life cycle of the mine. ATSI fellow Kingsley Dixon, for example, he's an expert in mine site restoration. We've got Anna Giacomini, who's an expert in rock wall stability. We've got experts in extracting trace minerals using plant technologies, for example. There are lots of different ways that we can do this. One of the pieces of advice that the Academy's been giving to the government and the industry is around how to ensure that those principles of the circular economy are embedded throughout the entire life cycle of products, and that includes at the very start when you're digging them out of the ground. How do we make sure that that's being done responsibly, both for environmental management and for emissions management? How do we make sure that those sites are crafted from the beginning with an intention to be fully rehabilitated when they come to the end of their life cycle? And there's been a lot of sophistication grown in the sector over the last decade or so towards that, so the capability is definitely there. I think there's a general agreement in Australia that we can't sort of take an old school attitude to just extracting the minerals and stomping off. There are also obviously cultural considerations. Many of these potential mine sites are in culturally sensitive and significant areas. So there are lots and lots of different factors that have to come into play to do this well. It is difficult, but it is also worth doing. All this green energy revolution, the new digital technologies, they're not actually going to happen without rare earth and critical minerals.
So I'm sure you're aware that there's a steady stream of New Zealand migrants who head across to Australia, and this tends to increase when our domestic economy is weak and or when the Australian economy is particularly strong, such as during the mining boom a few years ago. So I'm just interested whether the Future Made in Australia initiative could encourage, I guess, New Zealand workers and business people, indeed, to move to Australia or invest in Australia. So in terms of job creation that could come out of it, what sort of skills do you think are going to be in demand, and what sort of, I guess, parts of Australia might we see demand for more workers?
Well, there's no doubt that this package it'll place substantial demand on the skilled workforce, and we know that the STEM skilled workforce in particular is going to be increasingly in demand. It's already an area where we need to address shortages. So at the moment, around 48% of professional occupations were in shortage across Australia last year, and that's up from 39% the year before. There's a similar shortage in the technical and trades occupations in Australia. So we are both going to have to train new people domestically as a matter of priority, and in addition to that, rely on skilled migration. I think traditionally it's probably reasonable to assume that some of that skilled migration might come from New Zealand. The federal government is investing around $600 million, I think, in this coming financial year to train Australian workers and retrain displaced workers in particular, as well as training women to be supported to enter and thrive in traditionally male-dominated industries. But we know that the energy sector, the construction sector, anything that's sort of involved in building, maintaining and running that resilient infrastructure, these are areas where we are in desperate need already. And I think that is pretty reasonable to assume it'll only continue to grow.
Do you think also that automation and I guess AI is a big buzzword these days too, is that going to play a part?
In terms of the skills and the workforce shift?
Well, in terms of, I guess, filling some of the roles that are needed, I mean, maybe not the more high-skilled end of it.
Yeah, what we're seeing with AI and automation is not that jobs are disappearing, but the nature of the jobs that are required is changing. So there are quite a few sectors, ranging from the entertainment industry through to the mining industry, if we want to go back there, in which AI has increasingly got a part to play. There are some really sophisticated technologies that are building safety for people in those industries as well. What it means is that the place where humans can have the best value add, can bring the best skills to bear on those industries and those sectors, is changing. And there's always going to be a need for more people. I don't think it's as simplistic as saying that AI is going to take over everybody's jobs. It's a little bit like the effect that the steam engine had on catalysing the Industrial Revolution. We're at a similar kind of stage in terms of economic evolution. The steam engine changed not just the way that people work, but also the way that they live, the way that they play. And AI and advanced computing technologies are having a similar effect now. We're not going to know the full breadth of that until after the fact. So maybe come back and ask me in 20 years and I'll give you a much better answer.
Great. I'll make a note in my diary.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, also, I mean, this is obviously a Future Made in Australia. It's a federal government initiative, but is there also going to be opportunities for private sector investment? And I guess if I'm a New Zealand entrepreneur who maybe is looking at clean energy sector, renewable energy, Could there be some opportunities maybe to bring my ideas and investment to Australia as well?
Absolutely. And that is perhaps looking at a mix of regulatory change and incentive frameworks as well as private investment mechanisms, because Australia has traditionally been a really terrific generator of ideas and technologies. We have not traditionally been terribly supportive, or as supportive as we probably should have been, of translating and applying that knowledge domestically and using it to create successful businesses. So that's something that this government certainly focused on and keen to change. It's something that the academy and the fellows that I work with are very, very keen to support as well. We see enormous opportunity, and there are so many ideas here that and in our global region that could and should be applied, commercialised, and brought out to market. One of the other focus areas that we've got simultaneously with this Future Made in Australia push is, of course, building capacity in the global region. And there is a huge place, a huge part to play for New Zealand, for Pacific Island nations, and other near neighbours like Indonesia in collaborating to research and commercialise those developments, particularly in the technology and engineering spaces, and to do that to mutual benefit, so that we build the capacity for the entire region. We're not interested in kind of being the best amongst everybody. We're interested in being amongst equals and lifting the whole region. So yeah, absolutely, there'll be opportunities. And then there are specific funds, such as, for example, the Global Science and Technology Diplomacy Fund, which my academy administers. At the moment, we've just closed expressions of interest on our first round of grants to support that collaborative R&D in priority areas like green hydrogen, like mRNA technologies, with priority partner nations and areas around the globe, and that includes New Zealand and Pacific Island nations. So there are specific mechanisms that the government's hoping individuals and businesses will leverage to be able to grow that.
So, one of the goals of a future made in Australia is to make Australia a renewable energy superpower. So, can you just give us a little bit maybe of context here, and where does Australia sort of place itself on a global scale at the moment as a renewable energy supplier, and what has to happen for it to be a superpower?
Quite a lot is the short answer to that. What we're looking at in Australia is a lot of potential. We've got a lot of the factors that can be woven together if we're really strategic about it to take our place there as a superpower. We've got the minerals we've already spoken about. We've got abundant natural energy sources: solar, wind, wave, and water. Um, we have the research credibility and the track record on some of these technologies. We have an incredible appetite for these technologies as well in terms of the retail market. Australia is the hungriest home solar power consumer in the world. We have got more solar per capita. We've got more solar across Australian houses than anywhere else. So there are lots of ingredients there that are ripe and ready for exploitation. We also have an interesting and challenging geographic scenario with respect to making resilient and viable clean energy. We're so dispersed. Our small population is spread out across vast distances. And so we've got to get innovative about the way that we transport and store that energy too. And all of that's actually driving really world-leading innovation. But it is still potential at this point, and part of that is because our climate change policies are lagging behind those of many around the world. We are late to this party. There are many nations that have been much more forward-thinking over the last couple of decades. Better late than never, but we've got some ground to make up, and that's part of why we've been calling for a huge uplift in investment in R&D in Australia, because of course you can't develop and apply and commercialise these technologies if you haven't got the knowledge to you haven't generated the knowledge to base it on in the first place. So we are behind in terms of the percentage that we invest in research and development by OECD standards. We would like to be lifting it up. We're at about 1.7% across the economy of GDP. Obviously, not all of that's government investment; that's business investment as well. But we'd like that to be at about 3% if we're going to see a significant step change, and that's where the bigger players, places like Japan and Germany, UK, US, are pitching their investment at 3% of GDP. So there are some things that we still need to do here. That skills and workforce piece is also obviously going to be potentially an inhibitor if we don't get really clever really quickly at getting that volume of people through with the right skills to be able to make a go of this, and both domestically and through skilled migration.
Now, of course, when a government comes out with a major initiative like that, like this, there's always some criticism, especially from the opposition politicians. And one of them has been that the government could be picking winners that might not actually turn out to be winners. I'm just well, another one that I saw is the suggestion that there could be handouts for billionaires and subsidies could be and incentives could be channeled towards big companies with established technologies and manufacturing bases at the expense of small and innovative firms. I'm just wondering, what are the dangers of these types of things happening, and what efforts or steps are being taken to prevent it? And one thing I noted that may be related to this in the actual document itself is a national interest framework. So, I mean, is that designed to, I guess, make sure that things don't go off track?
Yeah, I mean, yes, obviously, a national interest framework's an interesting way, one possible way to have a look at it. And yeah, I think, though, when you are looking to make step change very, very quickly, and particularly when we're looking to perhaps catch up, as I mentioned, to some of those more advanced economies and more complex economies, and more green economies, we do have to pick both big winners and support potential smaller winners. We're not going to get there quickly enough if we don't. I'm not interested in getting into a debate about whether billionaires are getting subsidies. I'm interested in looking at mechanisms to incentivize and scale those technologies, those companies, those frameworks that are actually already proven and working, so that we can get on with it as quickly as possible. So there have got to be a range of different mechanisms there, and a range of different incentives. I've spoken about the R&D investment that we think is required. We know in Australia that for every dollar invested in R&D, it brings about a $3.50 return to the economy. So it's a demonstrably worthwhile investment, and one that we have to continue to make, while we're also supporting and incentivizing businesses to scale up, and to really make that shift where they've been investing in perhaps carbon producing enterprise, to see the viability, and the profitability of becoming part of that green economy.
So obviously, we've witnessed rising geopolitical tensions in recent years between the United States and China, obviously the two economic global superpowers. And obviously, like New Zealand, China is Australia's key export market. And obviously, the US is the traditional security partner. And obviously, the US under President Biden and before him, President Trump, have been pushing back at China with tariffs and that type of thing. So I'm just wondering, I mean, is there a danger here that Australia could be forced to pick a side between China as Australia's key export market and the US as its key security partner?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question, but I think what I can say is that from the research and development perspective, and then of course obviously the commercialization of that R&D, it is a global enterprise. It's a collaborative enterprise. It doesn't work unless our people collaborate across international barriers. And the reality is that the two biggest investors in research and development on the planet are China and the United States. And so I think it would be foolish for any small economy to decide that it wasn't going to play with one of those economies when it comes to being part of that conversation, and that race to develop new technologies. One of the wonderful things about research and about science is that it often can and does transcend political boundaries and national boundaries. It has been used as a very, very effective tool for maintaining relationships when perhaps some other kinds of relationships can be a little bit tricky to manage. I think it would be a very great shame if the current geopolitics resulted in a situation where we were not able to engage in that collaborative activity with really key research partners.
So would an ideal scenario be that, I guess, new exports were created out of this initiative, and China and the US were both markets for them, and you already mentioned Japan as well, as a potential market. So is that a hope of this?
Oh, look, Australia would hope to export clean energy technologies to anywhere in the world. We're not going to play favourites. We really very much hope that we become one of the drivers globally of that widespread adoption of that technology.
So I mentioned at the start that in the budget, this was announced as a $22.7 billion investment over the next decade. Quite a bit of that money is tax incentives, I believe. So can you just give us a breakdown of, I mean, how much of this is expected to be tax incentives, how much is cash, and are there any other sources of that money?
Look, we're still actually waiting for a lot of that detail. What I can say is that a large amount of that funding that's already been announced is direct spending on various programs, but there are still a lot of details to be released. We know that about $17.2 billion over the next decade has been flagged as tax incentives, and the rest comes through a range of funding mechanisms, from co-investment as well to direct investment. So I guess the aims of that is to support those innovative technologies, attract and enable investment so that those government investments can be leveraged to build more, and to add value to those resources and strengthen economic security. Hopefully also that investment goes to support Australia's commitments under those international obligations like the Paris Agreement to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
And am I right in thinking that there's a Future Made in Australia Act that the government will be looking to pass? Do we know when?
That is my understanding, and no, I do not.
Okay. Look, Kylie, like one of the things I like to do at the end is ask the guests to sort of get their crystal ball out. So I'll ask you to do that. And I'm just curious to see ultimately, what do you believe a Future Made in Australia initiative can achieve, and how likely it is to actually do this?
I would like to think that in 20 or 30 years, we are looking back on this as a catalyst for a much more sustainable future. And I mean that both in terms of economically sustainable and societal well-being, and in terms of environmentally sustainable. I think if we do this really well, we can build a more circular economy. We can reduce our waste as well as our emissions. We can see small-scale manufacturing and pop-up factories all over the place. There are some really interesting and pretty great technologies coming up where, for example, for a micro factory the size of a shipping container can take glass and fabric being recycled from a building site and turn it into a new material to use in a new building on the same site. I'd like to see a huge and widespread adoption of renewables, and I'm hoping that when we look back, we see not only that resilient infrastructure within Australia, but a booming export market for those products as well, ranging right through from the energy and the fuels through to those slightly value-added up the chain minerals exports. Green agricultural exports as well, and a range of other stuff which frankly you and I haven't heard of because it probably hasn't been invented yet.
Absolutely. Look, thanks so much for that, Kylie. That's Kylie Walker, who is the CEO of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering and a visiting fellow at the Australian National University in Canberra. And I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.